Oh,
Bingo.
oh, bingo.
Bingo. Calling Chris Anderson back in Studio W1.
I am back in Studio W1. It's no longer my daughter's bedroom. So, and you are back in, well, you're still in Chicago.
I'm in the same old place in Chicago. What is that behind you, Chris? What? I mean, that's a pile of stuff there. We got to zoom in to see this. What's going on?
So this is what happens when you're waiting for your bookcases to be built. So, Stephen, if you're watching, yeah, this is what you're reduced to.
Is this Stephen who lives in Aldbourne?
Yes.
All right. I know that Stephen.
He's been working on built-in bookcases for me.
He's probably building a car or something, or a Nissan Hut or something else instead. And can you, if there was a book back there, and I said, "Where's this book?" Could you dive in and immediately find it?
No, because so what happened was these were all stacked up in my wife's office, and of course, as you might understand, she said it's time for these to go now. So when I was taking them out of her office, I was pulling out books for my next two tours, which are in another stack over there.
Okay.
So these are the
Just Be Believers.
These are the not next to tours stack.
Okay.
And yeah. So.
Well, and before we start the show, we should also mention that you have a new desk.
I do.
And it's a distinctive old desk, right?
Yes, it is a 1930s British civil service desk. It's ginormous, so I have lots of acreage, and it belonged to a Mr. Jones in 16A. So
wow. Well, things are happening in Studio W1.
They are.
And, naturally, just send something to our accounting department. We'll cover.
I will, absolutely.
We'll cover everything.
So what I'm planning to do is so that it always remains Studio W1 and doesn't revert to being my daughter's bedroom. I put so much shit in here that we couldn't actually fit a bed in here, and so that's
awesome. Good job. Yeah. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out the rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And hey, thanks to everybody who is a Patreon supporter. And here's our top shelf supporters. We were especially thankful to those guys, but to everybody, right? Everybody
absolutely
supports us on Patreon. And you can do that. New year, new chance to become a Patreon supporter. Patreon.com/History Happy Hour. And Chris, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening in your car, maybe to the HHH
podcast.
Oh, yeah. We're glad you're here. And we'll be talking today about Thomas Paine.
Yes.
So Chris, do we have anybody watching?
We do.
And who are they?
Well, Wally's joined us. And yes, Wally, I do know that I was waiting for these bookcases a year ago. I believe me, I'm painfully aware of that fact. And we're going to have a big reveal party should they ever actually get done. But Wally's joined us. Ted from Virginia, Lynn. And Doreen's back with us, which is great. Susan Ricardo from upstate New York, first-time listener. So we're welcome to Susan for joining us, and Cheryl from North Carolina. So yeah.
Oh well, fantastic. So I think we're ready to go, right?
All right.
So give me a cue and we'll get started. Okay.
Yes.
The bar is
open.
Okay. It's a new year. We're trying to try new things, whatever. 250 years ago this week, a man recently moved to the colonies from Great Britain, published one of the most famous and influential pamphlets in history. His name was Thomas Paine, and twice in 1776, his words were to change the course of the American Revolution. He's the founding father we sometimes leave out of the conversation, but Jack Kelly is here to bring him back with his new book, Thomas Paine, The Words That Rallied a Nation and the Founder for Our Time. Jack has done a bunch of stuff, but the important thing to remember is he's been on HHH twice before to talk about Valcour Island and Benedict Arnold. Jack, welcome back. Congratulations on your new book, which comes out on Tuesday.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick and Chris. Great to be with you.
And did you bring a cocktail with you?
Well, I've got my cocktail of the day is Founder's Porter, in honor of Thomas Paine's lack of recognition as a founder in many of the list of the founders. So
yeah.
And Chris, what did you bring to drink?
Well, I'm drinking up the last of the holiday wine, so I haven't quite caught dry January, but I'm sort of approaching it.
Okay, well, I am into dry January.
Wow.
4 days in here, drinking.
You've always been ahead of the curve, Rick.
I'm hoping to get my memory back, because when it comes,
what are you drinking?
Tea. I'm drinking tea.
See, there you go.
English breakfast tea.
Well done. Is it breakfast?
With cream and sugar.
Ooh. Where is it breakfast time there?
No. I need a little caffeine to keep up with you.
Okay.
Jack's like, when are we going to talk about Tom Paine? Jack, let me start out with a question. I'll bet you can answer this question. The question is, who is Tom Paine? I mean, and who is he in a nutshell? Because undoubtedly, we have viewers from Europe who don't even know the name. We may have some American viewers who are trying to remember their 5th grade textbook. Who was he briefly, and why remember him?
Well, I think the two words that I think sum up Thomas Paine is A, he was a working man, and B, he was an Englishman. And coming from a working class background gave him a different perspective than most of the American founders, certainly. And coming from England, and he just came over in 1774, so it was just like 6 months before the Revolutionary War broke out. He had a different perspective on a lot of things because of that. He had a much more direct experience of the aristocratic presumption that was dominant in England, the corruption that was in England, the inequality that was in England, the class structure in England. He had all that, could see that very personally, whereas a lot of Americans had a kind of a romantic view of the old country and a little bit of nostalgic view of England. He had grown up as a poor working class guy in England and had a much harder view, I'd say, of the English. So I think those two ideas went through his entire career of the sympathy for the working man and the real animosity towards British aristocratic structure of the society.
Okay, so moving on from that, Jack, and kind of getting down to the weeds a bit, because as you say, he doesn't get to America until he's 37 years old, so he's already lived a life. And as a working man, he's not going to have kind of gone through the usual educational circuit that a lot of other people do. So tell us kind of a bit more about his education and sort of where his ideas are coming from. Where is he picking up these gifts that really aren't revealed until he comes to America?
Yeah, his father was a corset maker, which some people tend to snicker a little bit about that. So he made his living on women's underwear, but it was a very respectable profession, and it was very hard work, very competitive business. Almost all women wore corsets at that time, so that there was a demand, but there was also a lot of people that got into the business. And his parents really had a scrimp just to give him an elementary school education. But when he was 12 years old, Thomas Paine went to work for his father as an apprentice, learned the corset making trade, and became a corset maker himself, and pursued that for a good few years. He also had other jobs like teaching school. He eventually got a job as a tax collector in England, and was holding on to the lowest rung of the English middle class, you could say, and really worked all his life. All the rest of his education after 8th grade was he educated himself, and he used to pay for courses. When he had a little extra money, he'd go and take an astronomy course. So he was not an intellectual. He was never rich, and never very good at business. Even the corset business, he didn't do very well in. But he got by, and he ended up losing his job as a tax collector. He separated from his wife, and he decided to try his luck in America.
On her dime.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, I heard that
from his wife to
nicely done
to get her out from under his debts. She gave him, I think it was £50, which was about a year's pay at that time. And he had the other advantage of being friendly with Benjamin Franklin, and he went to Franklin, and Franklin gave him a recommendation, which was very valuable. He came over and landed in Philadelphia, which was, of course.
Okay, so before we get him to the colonies, he's friendly with Benjamin Franklin. What, do they run into each other at the laundromat? I mean, how does he become friends with Ben Franklin? That would seem to me not a particularly easy thing to do in London in 1774.
Well, Paine did travel in fairly sophisticated circle. Goldsmith, who was a Parliament, Irish member of Parliament, he was friendly with, and he went to some of the sessions they had in the taverns in London when he lived in London. He was in London from time to time. He didn't have a long residence there, but every once in a while he'd stayed in London for a while, and he got to know Franklin. So, and I think it's the current feeling, and there's a new edition of Paine's entire works coming out, that he did more writing with Franklin than people had thought, that he had that actually collaborated on some writing while both of them were still in England. Franklin, I think at that point, had been in England for quite a number of years. So that was, it was two guys who, both from the working class, both interested in science, and they became quite close compatriots after they did meet.
Jack, in the course of your research, did you come across anything from the time before Paine comes to America? Is there anybody in England saying, hey, look at this guy, or he's a great speaker, or is anybody struck by him prior to his coming to America?
I would say no. He was not a prominent in any sense, except when he was working as a tax collector. He was assigned to the city of Lewis, which is down near Brighton on the south coast of England. Yeah. And that city was considered a very radical city. They had been on the side of the Roundheads, I guess, during the Puritan uprising, and one of the favorite things for them to do was have debates in the tavern, and Thomas Paine was a great tavern debater, and I think he learned a lot of his literary skills really in that sort of parry and thrust atmosphere of drinking pints of ale and talking over the heated issues of the day, of which the American colonies was one of them.
Because you talk about the Headstrong Club.
The Headstrong Club, it was called. It was met in the Bull House, I think, was the tavern that they met in, and they gave a prize for the best arguments, the hottest arguments, and Paine often won that prize. And I think that a lot of his writing has the feel of conversation, even Common Sense, where it was fairly well structured, but particularly The American Crisis, which was a second big pamphlet. It's almost like you're walking along talking to somebody, and that was his style. It had a kind of an oral style, which went over very well with people. They found it very easy to read and to take in. So,
well, so he comes to the colonies, and let's just say, parenthetically, that maybe all that time he's spending in the pub there arguing is one of the reasons for the divorce that enables him to come to the colonies. But okay, so what happens to him? He comes to Philadelphia, it's 6 months before the battles of Lexington and Concord. Presumably, the first Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia at the time. What happens to him? What kind of work does he get, and how does this lead towards common sense?
Well, he was always a city man. Even when he was in England, he loved London, and Lewis was quite a small city, but he had some urban flavor to it. And when he got to Philadelphia, which was, of course, the largest city in North America, it was the perfect place for him. He loved taverns, he loved coffee houses, and hanging around talking to people. He was very congenial. He met people very easily and developed a wide range of friends almost overnight, including Benjamin Rush. He would hang around bookstores, which was how he got a job. One of the bookstore owners was putting out a magazine or starting up a magazine. And so he hired Thomas Paine, who had some writing experience in England, to be the editor of that magazine. And Paine started writing articles under pseudonyms and editing other articles that people submitted. And that was his first job in America. And through that, he got a reputation for being a writer. And eventually some of his friends, including Benjamin Franklin, who had come back to America by then, Benjamin Rush, induced him to write a history of the conflict between Britain and the colonies. And Benjamin Rush said, he encouraged him to write this pamphlet, but he said, don't go too far. Don't mention the word independence. And of course, Thomas Paine totally ignored that advice, and he shaped the whole of Common Sense towards an argument for independence.
So, Jack, this is a comment that Thomas Jefferson made about Paine, and I'm sure we'll get to Jefferson later, but Jefferson said, "No writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, and perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple, unassuming language. In this, he may be compared with Dr. Franklin." Because this book is really kind of driven by Paine's writings and the influence of his writings. I know you've touched on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about him as a writer? I mean, where does this come from? Is it radically different than what had been gone before? I mean, where does this sort of style come from?
Yeah, I think it's a good you gave that quote, because I think that quote in itself shows the difference between Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. And they were friendly. They had a lot of the same views, but Jefferson was highly educated, and he wrote like that quote you just gave there, in a kind of flowery, roundabout, elusive way, whereas Thomas Paine always wrote in a very blunt, direct, down-to-earth way that was considered very radical at the time.
Yeah.
If we look at it now, it seems old-fashioned because it is 18th century. Mm-hmm. But if you compare Jefferson or many of the other pamphlets that were written at that time, they were written by intellectuals, and they were aimed at intellectuals, and they put in a lot of quotes from the classics and even Greek, quotes in Greek. Oh. And Thomas Paine had no education in the classics, and he wasn't interested in that. He was interested in getting the point across to a farmer or to a laborer, and he was able to do that. And that was one of the really magical things about Common Sense and the reason it took off so quickly was that people suddenly, it's like, here's something I can understand, and I'm just an ordinary farmer, but I can get the point that he's making. Whereas if you read another pamphlet by a different author, you might get just find it confusing, and why is he quoting Ovid and so forth.
So you would say, though, then, that this sort of his style, it was unique for that time.
I wouldn't say totally unique, but it sort of went back to they compare him to Daniel Defoe, mm-hmm. and to Jonathan Swift, who both had a much more down-to-earth style than some of the writing of their time. They were both a little bit earlier, but it was in the political writing, it was certainly either unique or very, very rare.
Okay.
Okay, so Common Sense comes out in January of 1776 and it explodes, right, across the colonies. So, what is the argument that Thomas Paine is making in a way that people can understand, and how, in this era of written word, it's a few years before they brought in the internet and the telephone and all that, how does it spread so fast? What kind of impact does it have? I realize that's three questions, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Hey, wait, you think about your answer for a minute there, Jack. But Chris,
Okay.
since you're harassing me, I want to
Yes.
just ask, who is that behind you, Chris, there on your books?
That's my bust of Tom Paine.
Yeah. There you go. So, because he's an Englishman.
Because he's an Englishman and a friend of the working man.
Okay. So back to you, Jack, to answer the Hydra question I've just asked you.
Yeah, they sometimes compare the pamphlets, and there were many pamphlets being published in the 18th century, late 18th century. They sometimes compare them to social media posts. I'm not sure that's a very accurate comparison, but they were meant to be cheaply, widely distributed. And Thomas Paine had the great luck, and it was totally luck, it was just happenstance, that I think it was within days of the publication of Common Sense, people were made aware of a speech that George III had given in the previous October, but word hadn't gotten there until January, in which he took the olive branch petition, as they called it, where it was a last-ditch try to smooth over, even though the war was going on now, to smooth it over and to say, oh, we're loyal subjects of the king. We just want a little adjustments made. And the king said, "Screw you," essentially. And I'm not falling for this flattery. You are in open rebellion, and you're going to submit or else. And that was the message that the king sent over, and arrived within several days of the publication of Common Sense. And people were outraged, and Common Sense took that outrage just by chance and focused it into a very strong support for independence. Before Common Sense, in the fall of 1775, the majority of Americans wanted reconciliation with the British Crown. They wanted a better deal, but they were ready to make that deal. Afterwards, and it wasn't overnight, but it was a tendency began, and a Common Sense very much accelerated the tendency towards independence. There was a lot more work that was done. Thomas Paine was involved in that work of getting independence pushed through, but he advocated for independence. He advocated for the idea that all men are created equal in January. And one of the stipulations in Common Sense was the best thing we can do is an open and direct declaration of independence. And 6 months later, that's what happened.
Yeah, but Jack, obviously, people now say Common Sense comes out and it strikes the colonies like a lightning bolt, and this is changing public opinion. But not everybody thought it was a great book piece. I mean, you quote John Adams, and he later in life he calls the pamphlet crapulous. So, what were the detractors to Common Sense? Were there people saying, "Wait a minute"?
The warning that Benjamin Rush had given to Paine did have substance to it, because there were a lot of people who were not going to be for independence no matter what. Right. And a lot of them, and they ended up as the loyalists. And also, John Adams is a difficult case, but they had a certain friendship.
John Adams is jealous. Come on,
he was jealous.
He's jealous of Thomas Jefferson. He's jealous of Thomas Paine.
Well, maybe
he's a great man, but he's jealous.
Well, maybe he's got a point. Maybe it's legitimate to say that. Hold your horses.
Crapulous.
Well, but Adams was for independence, but he didn't like the idea, the more radical idea that of what the government Paine wanted to substitute for the British government.
Right.
Later in their relationship, Adams called him said he was begotten by a wild boar and a bitch wolf. That was a type of insult. You don't hear those kind of insults much anymore.
What was it he said about?
He stewed, and of course by then the political rivalries and the political animosity of the 1790s had really pulled them apart. But
but I mean, I guess the reason I brought up that quote, and I'm glad the kind of conversation went the way it did, because it raises the point or a question I had is Paine getting out ahead of thought at this point? I mean, it seems like pretty early out of the gate, he's advocating for independence, and then he's advocating things that almost seem like they're getting ahead of what some of the founders kind of envisioned.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that, and the whole independence, the majority.
Jack, we've lost you.
What? There we go.
Philadelphia was a very radical city compared to other cities in America, and particularly in the working class. And Thomas Paine worked with people in Pennsylvania. The other aspect of, besides common sense, and the great common sense.
We're having some technical difficulties, folks. We're sorry about that. Jack, maybe you could, if you can hear me, maybe you can remove yourself and come back in again, because. And
that brought other colonies with them and got over the hump to get independence.
Jack, we had a lot of technical difficulty during your answer there, and I'm not sure that the audience heard most of it. So if you can give us a
paraphrase version.
Version of it again.
Thomas Paine worked with people in Philadelphia, the radicals in Philadelphia, Thomas Young and other people who were definitely, as Chris said, out in front of the general population of the colonies to push Pennsylvania to go for independence, and Pennsylvania then sort of push them over in the Congress to actually issue the Declaration of Independence. So both, I think that common sense has been underestimated, but it's also been overestimated, and partly it was because Thomas Paine said, I think they sold about 150,000 copies. And then later he said it was about 500,000 copies altogether. And somebody went back and looked at the capacity of all the printers in America, and they could not have printed that many, a 47-page document on a flatbed press. There was no physical way they could have produced that many copies that quickly. So it was exaggerated, and the effect is probably exaggerated somewhat, but it was certainly a very, very important push that ended up with the Declaration of Independence in July.
So there's a lot more that happens in this book, and we'll try to get to what we can of it. But I have one more question, on the subject we're on, and this is sort of what you always want to know. I want to try to get inside people's heads. But Lynn says, since he only came to the colonies very late, right, 18 months or so before writing Common Sense, how did he develop his ideas that he put into Common Sense? I mean, so we know he was a tavern debater. We know he was a tax collector. He was a printer, but suddenly he's not only advocating for independence, he's attacking very powerfully the King of England, which wasn't something that was done. He's calling him terrible names. He's really putting forward these ideas. Where do they come from?
I think that those ideas in particular, and I think one of the most radical ideas in Common Sense that very few people had talked about, because there's a lot of reverence for the king, even among the patriots. And Thomas Paine essentially said the king is a fraud, monarchy is a fraud, hereditary aristocracy is an insult to people. The division of people between rulers and subjects is an absurdity. And that's what he meant by all men are created equal, that aristocrats have no, you shouldn't be able to put your family perpetually ahead of other families. And that was something that came out directly, the fact, as I mentioned before, that he was a working man, he was on the lower echelons of society. He personally felt the condescension of aristocrats, something that Thomas Jefferson, for example, didn't feel, because he was the equivalent of aristocrat in America. So yeah, those ideas came directly from Paine's personal experience. He did read a lot. He did educate himself. He claimed he didn't read John Locke, but a lot of his ideas were very similar to Locke's ideas. But the truth of his ideas came from his personal experience, more so than from books. You know, he was not an intellectual, really. He was a man, a very thoughtful and brilliant an analyst of politics, but not not taking ideas from Voltaire and shaping them for America.
Yeah. So Jack, kind of speaking of we're going to move on, but I did want to also, because I think this is important, as far as spreading this idea, talked about how many copies were printed and whatnot, but Wally Morrison has asked, what was the literacy rate in the colony when Paine publishes Common Sense? And one wonders if the farmer really read it or had it read to him. So how is this how do you think it's getting spread?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't give an actual figure for the literacy rate. I think it was higher than it was in England, for example, yeah, or in Europe in general. Yeah. But there was still a fair number of people who are illiterate, and Common Sense was read aloud, as was the American Crisis, which is his later pamphlet, and the ideas kind of seeped out. It was reprinted in newspapers, and people would read it in a tavern. They might, hey, look what I found in the newspaper, and read it for people who weren't able to read. But the ideas certainly seem to get out quite quickly.
Yeah.
So your book is about Tom Paine, but it's also about what happens after Common Sense comes out, and you focus very closely on the fighting between General Howe's British Army and General Washington's Patriot forces between September 1776 to early January 1777. And much of this is a pretty painful time for the Americans, and I imagine for Thomas Paine, who's there with the American forces. Can you give us an overview of this campaign that all these guys are involved in, which as it turns out is like the biggest campaign of the American Revolution, and most people barely know it happened?
Yeah, after the Declaration of Independence was passed by Congress, Paine had advocated for a democratic republic, and he tried to do what he thought a citizen of a republic should do, and that he gave over all the profits that he made from Common Sense to buy supplies for the army. He then enlisted in a militia unit in Philadelphia called the Associators, which was sort of a democratic, short enlistment term, totally voluntary militia that had been dreamed up by Benjamin Franklin years before to get the Quakers of Pennsylvania to join the militia. And they were like a democratic fighting club, and they were sent out to Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and they began the campaign. The Battle of Brooklyn, the Patriots lost. Then the British captured New York City, and then they beat the Patriots in White Plains, and then they took over finally Fort Washington and completely wiped out the Patriot presence in New York and the New York area. And then they pushed across into New Jersey and chased Washington's army across the entire state of New Jersey. So it was one defeat after another. And Thomas Paine was in the military. He'd switched over from the Associators to the Continental Army, and was an aide to General Nathaniel Greene, who was one of Washington's top generals during this period. And he knew the enlisted men because he'd been one of them. He knew the officers because he was now, as an aide, he would dine with them. And so he had a unique view of the American military and of the catastrophe that was overtaking them. And they had started out with a 20,000-man army. By the time they get out to Pennsylvania, on the other side of the Delaware River, out of New Jersey, they were down to 3,000 men at times. So it was an absolute catastrophe. And Paine, in talking to the troops and talking to the civilians, got this idea for another pamphlet that he called The American Crisis, that came out in that December.
So Jack, so in the book you say that Paine writes the American Crisis in a passion of patriotism. So do you think that this is just something that he was compelled to write, or do you think that Nathaniel Greene or other members of the Continental Army said, okay, well, you're our greatest publicist, do something about this?
Well, he did mention that some of the officers, because he had to leave the army in order to go to Philadelphia and find a printer, and things were pretty chaotic in Philadelphia at that time. A lot of people were leaving, including Congress had already departed from Philadelphia because they thought the British were going to take the city over. And so he said, well, some officers suggested that he do that, but he'd been taking notes and thinking about it, I think, all through the campaign, of how can I raise the morale? How can I assure the people that, we can still prevail? And that had been one of his themes in Common Sense too, is we can prevail. The British seem to have all the advantages militarily, but America has resources of its own. So I think that it was a little bit of a combination, but I think it was pretty much came out of it was a much more emotional pamphlet than Common Sense, which was a carefully reasoned argument for independence. This was just a rallying cry. And of course, it started with his most famous quote, which was, these are the times that try men's souls. And he went on to make fun of those who were dropping along the wayside and calling them summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. And he really channeled the feelings of the troops in order to raise their morale. And that was the whole purpose of it. And it was quite an eloquent and very carefully aimed to do that, and it had that effect.
So yeah, I to the whole starting paragraph, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. So this is published, I think, on December 19th.
Right.
The Battle of Trenton is 6 days later. That's Washington's great comeback victory against the Hessians, against the British Empire. So it's only 6 days. How are we to judge its impact on the American army there?
Well, I always try to look at history as not as a row of dominoes where it has one thing affects another and there's a cause and effect relationship. I think for a lot of things, it's more like a flywheel. So something gets the flywheel moving, and then other factors come in and give it an impetus, or they may slow it down, but there's different factors, and the impetus keeps building. And I think that there's no way you can say, well, George Washington read the American Crisis, so he made this decision to cross over the Delaware River back into New Jersey. But he was certainly aware of it. I mean, it was well enough, you know, it's been documented, it was well enough circulated around the Army, and that he would have known about it if he didn't read it in detail. The same thing with the troops. The battles at Trenton, and there's actually 2 battles fought there, were very close calls, and particularly the second battle. So any impetus that's accelerated that flywheel of morale and of determination of the troops was useful, and I think that the American Crisis was a factor. Whether it was a decisive factor is impossible to say.
So, Jack, is Paine signing this pamphlet? Do people know who he is, and what are the loyalists and the British saying about him as a writer and his pamphlets?
Well, he actually the comment signed in English, so that was an anonymous, but it very quickly got out who he was, you know, who had written it. And then he was almost captured at Fort Lee when the British took Fort Lee from the Americans. And one of the British officers said, "We found some of that scoundrel Common Sense man's letters, and we can read them at our leisure." And that was the nickname he'd gotten, was Common Sense. So then he started signing and I think the American Crisis was signed by Common Sense as his nickname. So it was a thinly veiled anonymity, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Can I follow up in the second half of Chris's question, which is what were the British opinions of this incendiary American writer? Were there any?
Well, you know, the only particular quote I know is from that officer. It's called him a scoundrel, but yeah, they were not happy about it, and particularly the insults to the king. I mean, he referred to the king. It wasn't clear he was referring to King George, but king, he said, the king is a worm who in the midst of his splendor is crumbling into dust. That was from Common Sense.
He must have been listening to John Adams.
The British didn't like that kind of language used about their royalty.
So let me ask you, let me take you back. As I say, a big chunk of this book is about the fighting that goes on, and it's very interesting stuff. And I wanted to just ask you, I'm going to be leading a tour called the Campaigns of George Washington, and we're going to be going over many of the battlefields in New Jersey as part of this. During the course of your book, Washington is defeated in multiple encounters with the enemy, and he is dissed and dismissed by several of his subordinates. He's confronted with terrible weather. He's got panicked soldiers refusing to listen to orders in the Battle of New York. He's got a Congress that offers virtually no assistance. And the thing that impresses me about Washington is that he just accepts all this, and he shoulders these burdens, maybe stoops a little lower, but he keeps going, and he remains optimistic that he can somehow rally the troops to defeat the British. And in my opinion, and I understand that Chris may have issues with this, it's really during this period that Washington demonstrates or begins to demonstrate his possible greatness. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. I think that you could even say that the first battle at Trenton, where they captured 900 Hessians, it was the first victory, really, the first substantial victory of the entire campaign. That was the cap on the transformation of Washington from a hesitant, dubious, always looking for a little bit too much complication in his tactics, to a really bold leader that he showed afterwards. And the second Battle of Trenton was actually a much riskier battle, a much more audacious attack of going across and facing the British army, because in the original first Battle of Trenton, it was only the Hessians. Now the British army was there and the Hessian army, and there was no more opportunity to retreat because they had the river at their back, and they fought the British to a standstill, and then slipped out, defeated the British rearguard at Princeton, and that totally changed the war. And that was a very, very bold operation on Washington's part, and he seemed to sort of finally get his bearings, and a lot of the criticism, the earlier criticism, evaporated.
Yeah, Washington. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about General Howe. I can't
well, excuse me. Back to the subject of the book. Okay,
I've got another question if I can follow it up, because
lies. Okay,
let's absolutely General Howe, the British commander, seems to me to kind of lack that killer instinct.
He does
in this campaign. He's got several opportunities to really wipe out Washington and his army, but he lets him get away. So is this bad luck, bad generalship, or is Howe intentionally trying to give Washington a way out? And now I will bow out and let Chris. Chris, you can respond too if you wish. Okay.
Oh, okay.
But Jack, you first.
My view is that I think Howe was was trying to balance his role as the peacemaker and his role as the general, and he thought if he could pull it off in a way that was the cheapest for the British Crown, which they didn't want to spend any more money than they had to, or lose any more men than they had to, because they didn't have a lot easy way to replenish them. That was the best thing, and I think they felt that they'd won the war. And by December, the middle of December of 1776, they had won the war. And all that was left was 3,000 or 4,000 ragtag, undersupplied troops over in Pennsylvania, and that was the reason they didn't keep pushing them. It was simply to have a cleaner and cheaper, and he didn't want to leave a lot of ill will behind him from being a very forceful attacks on the Americans, because he knew that they still had a rule that whoever was left once they had won the war, and he felt that they were winning the war so easily, why go overboard and then create a lot of animosity. So I think that it's hard to know what was going through his head, because I think both the Howes were very closed-mouth type of men, but I think that was probably somewhat what he was thinking.
So, Jack, I mean,
did you have an opinion on this?
No,
you want to register?
No.
Okay.
You do. Okay. So when we talk about the Howe brothers, somebody writes a book about them, then we'll. But I certainly wish that they were a little bit more vigorous. But anyway, so the conflict, the revolution, the Civil War, turns out as it does. But Paine goes on, and I think that one of the things that I had made a note to say when we were talking about common sense, he says the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. So he kind of has a bigger audience in mind, I think. And so what happens to him after the revolution? This isn't his first revolution, right?
Yeah, he pretty much retired from politics. He wanted to get into bridge building, and literally building an iron bridge. And he went over to Europe to try to raise money for this idea he had for an invention of his, which was the iron bridge. And while he was there, the French Revolution broke out. He became the champion of the French Revolution in the early days, because he saw this as, the seed I planted in America is now bearing fruit around the world. And this is what I always thought was going to happen. And now the whole world is going to go in the way of becoming democratic republics, and we're going to get rid of all the monarchs. And he was very enthusiastic about the French Revolution. Unfortunately, the French Revolution went off the rails, and including Thomas Paine himself ending up in a dungeon and coming very close to having his head cut off. But that didn't impress people back in America who tied him so closely to the French Revolution, which then had gotten in such bad odor that his reputation really never recovered. And he also wrote a book called The Age of Reason, which was a humanist critique of the Christian religion, which went over like a pound of lead, and ended up sinking his reputation much further. And he was known as an atheist and an infidel, and ended up with, and I think down to today, you'd have to say, still has a distorted reputation because of some of that, which he doesn't deserve, but that's the way it ended up.
Well, and he also fell out with Washington, right?
And he had a falling out because he thought that Washington had not done enough to get him out of the dungeon. He considered himself still an American citizen, and citizenship was a little bit fluid in those days, but he thought that Washington should have made an effort, and he did not, and he left him in day after day of wondering whether his head was going to be cut off. So he developed an animosity against Washington, even though they'd been friendly, and Paine had been a big supporter of his. And he wrote a letter, very ill-advised, I think, wrote a letter to Washington laying out all these arguments and even criticizing him for being a bad general, which was, it made Paine look stupid. And so that added to the demise of his reputation as well.
Mm-hmm. So towards the end of your book, you write, few of his contemporaries surpassed him in his clarity of vision, his empathy with common people, or his penetrating understanding of the needs of democratic government. He remains a central figure in our nation's birth. So is he ever going to be honored the way that you think he should be? I mean, look, there's a Jefferson Memorial, there's a Lincoln Memorial, there's a Washington Monument, Alexander Hamilton's got statues, Lafayette has statues, Thomas Paine not honored so much. So will you think that will ever get righted? Is this the year?
I'm hoping this is going to be the year that Thomas Paine at least begins to get the recognition that he deserves. There's been a committee trying to get a monument, of which there are very few monuments to Thomas Paine. I think a couple of them are in England, very few in this country. They passed a legislation to put one up on the mall in Washington. It's never come about, and there's a committee still working on it. Congressman Jamie Raskin is a big leader of that effort, and I think it can happen. I think that people can. We've looked at the founders and seen their flaws more in the last 20 years than we ever had before. And Jefferson, Washington, they were rich, they were slave owners, they had ideas that were a little backward. And we can look at Thomas Paine and say, well, this is just the opposite. He didn't own slaves. He was a working man. He was sympathetic with people. He was optimistic. He believed in America, and he really deserves a place in the pantheon.
So just kind of, we've been touching on this a bit, but Barry Milgate had asked a question, and I think it's kind of germane to what we're talking about here. Was Paine too revolutionary for the other founders? Is that part of it? We talked earlier about, did he get a little bit too far ahead of sentiment, or?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and there's a certain truth to that. I mean, he was talking about India, for example, in 1774, 75. Very few people were considering what were the British doing in India, and they had been responsible, at least partly responsible, for like 10 million people dying of a famine over there, and they were putting their imperial stamp on India. He was for old age pensions. He was for public education. These were ideas that would come along, and some of them are still being debated today. What does equality mean? How far should we go in terms of equality? So he was ahead of his time, and I think that hopefully, we'll catch up with him.
So I guess that's what makes him a founder for today. Jack Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your new book coming out on Tuesday, Tom Paine's War, The Words That Rallied a Nation and the Founder for Our Time. And if you're one of the people who signed up to go on my Revolutionary War tour, definitely read this book because then you'll know where I got some of my material from. So that's good. Jack, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thanks to both of you. It's been great.
So, Jack, the next book, if you could write that book about the how,
and you could get to it, please, because just as an incentive, if you're on 5 times, you get a hat, and this is your 3rd time, so you just 2 more books, 2 more interviews, and then you will have a History Happy Hour hat, which is, of course, an incredible achievement. He's not even speaking. All right,
frozen. The joy, you're frozen.
Thank you, Jack. Okay. I would expect that to go over better. Okay. So, Chris, next week, 40 years after the publication of Eugene Sledge's very famous memoir, With the Old Breed, at Pelelu in Okinawa, his son Henry has written The Old Breed, The Complete Story Revealed. And we're going to talk with Henry Sledge next week about this book and about his father. And do you know Henry? I mean, you've been to the Pacific.
We've exchanged a few emails, but I knew. Well, it didn't. I mean, I corresponded a little bit with his dad, and so and on the Pelelu tour, I take my guests to a couple of places specifically mentioned in the book. So I've always had quite an attachment and admiration for that book. I think it's the finest memoir ever written by a soldier. So I'm anxious to talk to Henry because he's added additional material that wasn't in the first edition of the book. So even if you've read the book, this is a new take on it.
So fantastic. We had to put this interview off from December, I think, or whenever we originally had it when I was going to a Bears game. But we're glad to bring it to you now and look forward. And I look forward to hearing, what questions you have to ask with your great interest and great experience with Pacific War stuff. So guys, thank you so much for being here today. We had quite a few viewers. We do appreciate it. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on patreon.com, and browse all our old shows at historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.